a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Philippine-American War. The Philippine-American War was an armed conflict between the First Philippine Republic and the United States that lasted from February 4, 1899, to July 2, 1902. The Filipinos saw the conflict as a continuation of the Filipino struggle for independence that began in 1896 with the Philippine Revolution. The U.S. government regarded it as an insurrection. The conflict arose when the First Philippine Republic objected to the terms of the Treaty of Paris, under which the United States took possession of the Philippines from Spain, ending the Spanish-American War. Fighting erupted between forces of the United States and those of the Philippine Republic on February 4, 1899, in what became known as the Second Battle of Manila. On June 2, 1899, the First Philippine Republic officially declared war against the United States. The war officially ended on July 2, 1902, with a victory for the United States. However, some Philippine groups, led by veterans of the Katipunan, continued to battle the American forces for several more years. Among those leaders was General Macario Sakay, a veteran Katipunan member who assumed the presidency of the proclaimed Tagalog Republic, formed in 1902 after the capture of President Emilio Aguinaldo. Other groups continued hostilities in remote areas and islands, including the Moro people and Pulahans people, until their final defeat at the Battle of Budbagsak on June 15, 1913. The war and occupation by the U.S. changed the cultural landscape of the islands, as people dealt with an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 total Filipino civilians dead, disestablishment of the Catholic Church in the Philippines as a state religion, and the introduction of the English language in the islands as the primary language of government, education, business, industry, and among families and educated individuals increasingly in future decades. In 1902, the United States Congress passed the Philippine Organic Act, which provided for the creation of the Philippine Assembly, the members of which would be elected by Filipinos. This act was superseded by the 1916 Philippine Autonomy Act, which contained the first formal and official declaration of the United States government's commitment to eventually grant independence to the Philippines. The 1934 Philippine Independence Act created the Commonwealth of the Philippines the following year, a limited form of independence, and established a process ending in Philippine independence. The United States granted independence in 1946, following World War II, and the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, through the Treaty of Manila concluded between the two governments and nations. Philippine Revolution. Andres Bonifacio was a warehouseman and clerk from Manila. He established the Katipunan, a revolutionary organization which aimed to gain independence from Spanish colonial rule by armed revolt. On July 7, 1892, fighters in Cavite province won early victories. One of the most influential and popular leaders from Cavite was Emilio Aguinaldo, mayor of Cavite El Viejo, who gained control of much of the eastern portion of Cavite province. Eventually, Aguinaldo and his faction gained control of the leadership of the Katipunan movement. Aguinaldo was elected president of the Philippine Revolutionary Movement at the Tejeros Convention on March 22, 1897. And Bonifacio was executed for treason by Aguinaldo's supporters after a show trial on May 10, 1897. Aguinaldo is officially considered the first president of the Philippines. Aguinaldo's exile and return. By late 1897, after a succession of defeats for the revolutionary forces, the Spanish had regained control over most of the Philippines. Aguinaldo and Spanish Governor-General Fernando Primo de Rivera entered into armistice negotiations. On December 14, 1897, an agreement was reached in which the Spanish colonial government would pay Aguinaldo $800,000 Mexican pesos, which was approximately equivalent to $400,000 United States dollars at that time in Manila, in 3 installments if Aguinaldo would go into exile outside of the Philippines. Upon receiving the first of the installments, Aguinaldo and 25 of his closest associates left their headquarters at Biak Narbato and made their way to Hong Kong, according to the terms of the agreement. Before his departure, Aguinaldo denounced the Philippine Revolution, exhorted Filipino rebel combatants to disarm and declared those who continued hostilities and waging war to be bandits. Despite Aguinaldo's denunciation, some of the revolutionaries continued their armed revolt against the Spanish colonial government. According to Aguinaldo, the Spanish never paid the second and third installments of the agreed-upon sum. After only 4 months in exile, Aguinaldo decided to resume his role in the Philippine Revolution. He departed from Singapore aboard the steamship Malacca on April 27, 1898. He arrived in Hong Kong on May 1, which was the day that Commodore Dewey's naval forces destroyed Rear Admiral Patricio Montojo's Spanish Pacific Squadron at the Battle of Manila Bay. Aguinaldo then departed Hong Kong aboard the USRC McCulloch on May 17, arriving in Cavite on May 19. Less than 3 months after Aguinaldo's return, the Philippine Revolutionary Army had conquered nearly all of the Philippines, with the exception of Manila, which was surrounded by revolutionary forces some 12,000 strong. The Filipinos controlled the Philippines. Aguinaldo turned over 15,000 Spanish prisoners to the Americans, offering them valuable intelligence. Aguinaldo declared independence at his house in Cavite El Viejo on June 12, 1898. The Philippine Declaration of Independence was not recognized by either the United States or Spain, and the Spanish government ceded the Philippines to the United States in the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which was signed on December 10, 1898, in consideration for an indemnity for Spanish expenses and assets lost. On January 1, 1899, Aguinaldo was declared President of the Philippines, the only president of what would be later called the First Philippine Republic. He later organized a congress at Malolos in Bulacan to draft a constitution. Conflict origins. On April 22, 1898, while in exile, Aguinaldo had a private meeting in Singapore with the United States Consul E. Spencer Pratt, after which he decided to again take up the mantle of leadership in the Philippine Revolution. According to Aguinaldo, Pratt had communicated with Commodore George Dewey by telegram, and passed assurances from Dewey to Aguinaldo that the United States would recognize the independence of the Philippines under the protection of the United States Navy. Pratt reportedly stated that there was no necessity for entering into a formal written agreement, because the word of the Admiral and of the United States Consul were equivalent to the official word of the United States government. With these assurances, Aguinaldo agreed to return to the Philippines. Pratt later contested Aguinaldo's account of these events, and denied any dealings of a political character with Aguinaldo. Admiral Dewey also refuted Aguinaldo's account, stating that he had promised nothing regarding the future. Filipino historian Teodoro Agoncillo writes of American apostasy, saying that it was the Americans who first approached Aguinaldo in Hong Kong and Singapore to persuade him to cooperate with Dewey in wresting power from the Spanish. Conceding that Dewey may not have promised Aguinaldo American recognition and Philippine independence, he writes that Dewey and Aguinaldo had an informal alliance to fight a common enemy, that Dewey breached that alliance by making secret arrangements for a Spanish surrender to American forces, and that he treated Aguinaldo badly after the surrender was secured. Agoncillo concludes that the American attitude towards Aguinaldo showed that they came to the Philippines not as a friend, but as an enemy masking as a friend. The newly arrived Spanish Governor-General Fermin Jordines had made a secret agreement with his predecessor Basilio Augustin, along with Commodore Dewey and Brigadier General Wesley Merritt, according to which the Spanish forces would surrender only to the Americans, not to the Filipino revolutionaries. To save face, the Spanish surrender would take place after a mock battle which the Spanish would lose. The Filipinos would not be allowed to enter the city. On the eve of the battle, Brigadier General Thomas M. Anderson telegraphed Aguinaldo, "Do not let your troops enter Manila without the permission of the American commander. On this side of the Pasig River you will be under fire." On August 13, American forces captured the city of Manila from the Spanish. Before the attack on Manila, American and Filipino forces had been allies against Spain in all but name. After the capture of Manila, Spanish and Americans were in a partnership that excluded the Filipino insurgents. Fighting between American and Filipino troops had almost broken out as the former moved in to dislodge the latter from strategic positions around Manila on the eve of the attack. Aguinaldo had been told bluntly by the Americans that his army could not participate and would be fired upon if it crossed into the city. The insurgents were infuriated at being denied triumphant entry into their own capital, but Aguinaldo bided his time. Relations continued to deteriorate, however, as it became clear to Filipinos that the Americans were in the islands to stay. On December 21, 1898, President William McKinley issued a proclamation of benevolent assimilation. Major General Elwell Stephen Otis, who was military governor of the Philippines at that time, delayed its publication. On January 4, 1899, General Otis published an amended version edited so as not to convey the meanings of the terms sovereignty, protection, and right of cessation, which were present in the original version. However, Brigadier General Marcus Miller, then in Iloilo City, and unaware that the altered version had been published by Otis, passed a copy of the original proclamation to a Filipino official there. The original proclamation then found its way to Aguinaldo, who, on January 5, issued a counter-proclamation. My government cannot remain indifferent in view of such a violent and aggressive seizure of a portion of its territory by a nation which arrogated to itself the title of champion of oppressed nations. Thus it is that my government is disposed to open hostilities if the American troops attempt to take forcible possession of the Visayan Islands. I denounce these acts before the world, in order that the conscience of mankind may pronounce its infallible verdict as to who are true oppressors of nations and the tormentors of mankind. In a revised proclamation issued the same day, Aguinaldo protested most solemnly against this intrusion of the United States government on the sovereignty of these islands. Otis regarded Aguinaldo's proclamations as tantamount to war, alerting his troops and strengthening observation posts. On the other hand, Aguinaldo's proclamations energized the masses with a vigorous determination to fight what was perceived as an ally turned enemy. Outbreak of war. On the evening of February 4, Private William W. Grayson, a sentry of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry Regiment, fired the first shots of the war at the corner of Sosiego and Silencio Streets, in Santa Mesa. Upon opening fire, Grayson killed a Filipino lieutenant and another Filipino soldier. Filipino historians maintain that the slain soldiers were unarmed. This action triggered the 1899 Battle of Manila. The following day, Filipino General Isidoro Torres came through the lines under a flag of truce to deliver a message from Aguinaldo to General Otis that the fighting had begun accidentally, and that Aguinaldo wished for the hostilities to cease immediately and for the establishment of a neutral zone between the two opposing forces. Otis dismissed these overtures, and replied that the fighting, having begun, must go on to the grim end. On February 5, General Arthur MacArthur ordered his troops to advance against Filipino troops, beginning a full-scale armed clash. The first Filipino fatality of the war was Corporal Anastasio Felix of the 4th Company, Morong Battalion under Captain Sir Apio Narvaez. The battalion commander was Colonel Luciano San Miguel. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?